Welcome to the CEEDAR Center Lunch and Learn. Today we're demonstrating a new online tool, the Roadmap for Educator Preparation Reform. The Roadmap for Educator Preparation Reform is a planning framework intended to guide and support educator preparation programs to integrate evidence-based practices and high-leverage practices within and across coursework and fieldwork experiences. The roadmap highlights the major guidelines that EPP should consider throughout the reform process and provides supporting facilitation guidance, examples, resources, and tools from the EPPs that have engaged in and benefited from this process.
And we're going to dive right into this great new resource from CEEDAR. But first, I want to learn a little bit about who all is on our Lunch and Learn today. So my friend Matt is going to deploy a few polls for us to get to know who is here. So please take a look at these three questions. So first is, what is your role? Are you an IHE faculty member or leader, or are you coming to us from a state or district today? Next question, are you involved with CEEDAR in your state, yes or no? And then finally, third question, why are you attending today's Lunch and Learn? Which of these statements best describes your current involvement with this resource? So we'll give everyone a few moments to take a look at that, and then we'll take a look at who is here.
And as these results are coming in, if for some reason you don't see those questions on your Zoom screen, you can click the polling icon at the bottom, but it seems like most everyone is having no trouble answering these questions. And we'll give about 10 more seconds to finish the poll. All right, if you weren't able to access that, no problem. It seems like 90% of people were able to. So here's what the results look like. We have a pretty good spread.
And this is wonderful. Not surprisingly, have a lot of people joining us from IHEs today, quite a few state education agency personnel as well, and those of you in the other category, I'm glad you're here. For question two, it's wonderful. We have a nice mix of people who are already involved with CEEDAR and quite a few folks who are joining us who are not. So hopefully you're going to get to learn a little bit more about our resources today. And finally, the reason a lot of you are attending today's Lunch and Learn is because you are currently involved in prep reform efforts within your university or your state, and hopefully today we can provide you with some additional resources that can help with those efforts. So what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about the Educator Preparation Reform Guide. Apologies, let me get advanced. What I want to do for this Lunch and Learn is talk about what the purpose of the guide is, who it's for, and how it's structured. A lot of our time today is going to be spent, after I give you some background information, actually going into the online version of the tool. I'll give you a little walkthrough and a demo, and then we will end with any questions. Matt is going to help me moderate that through the chat pod. So as we go forward, please be recording any questions you have in that chat pod, and we'll get to those at the end of the Lunch and Learn. So first things first, what is the purpose of our roadmap for educator preparation reform? The roadmap was really what CEEDAR intended to be a planning framework for educator preparation program teams. And using this framework then to integrate evidence-based and high leverage practices within and across coursework and field experiences in this program. So again, this is a planning framework that's intended to guide conversation around how educator preparation programs integrate best practices for students with disabilities into their teacher preparation experiences. It's also important to know why this roadmap for educator preparation reform came into existence. And that is because we have done through the 325T grants and through current efforts with CEEDAR states, we have done a lot of reform projects at various universities that have integrated evidence-based practices for students with disabilities into teacher prep programs. And there have been a lot of lessons learned from those projects. All of those lessons learned, those really high quality projects that have happened, what we have attempted to do in this roadmap for educator preparation reform is capture those lessons, put them into a planning framework that can provide some guidance for other educator preparation programs who want to undertake similar reform efforts, and then provide some really high quality resources that support those efforts. So let's talk about who this roadmap is for. This is why we wanted to do that polling question at the beginning of our Lunch and Learn. This educator preparation roadmap is really for anyone who is involved with faculty efforts. It is intended for deans or program chairs who are leading program reform efforts, or faculty or other leaders at preparation programs who may be involved in things like program approval, accreditation, or reauthorization. We know as a part of that approval and accreditation process, programs are often asked to submit evidence that they have best practices integrated within their programs, and this roadmap can help provide resources to help you integrate those practices or demonstrate that you are already doing this. This is also for our state education agency and local education agency folks. A lot of what we talk about within the roadmap applies to not only teacher preparation, but it could also apply to in-service professional development and making sure those experiences are of high quality. So I'm going to briefly preview the steps of the roadmap. Our roadmap is broken into 8 sections that correspond with the steps of this program reform process. And what I'm going to do is preview those a little bit so that when we get into the tool, you can see how that fits together to support faculty and other leaders from the very beginning of the process when they're first thinking about their reform efforts through to the very end when they're thinking about sustainability and scale up. So of our 8 steps of the roadmap, our first step is to engage key leaders. We know this is a very important step, making sure that we have the right stakeholders at the table. We know that a lot of times preparation programs have collaborative partnerships with their state education agency or with local districts where they are placing teachers, and we need to make sure that we have the right people at the table to inform needed program improvements. The next step of the roadmap is to facilitate a needs assessment. The roadmap provides a lot of guidance and a lot of really great resources that can help a program that is at the beginning stages of considering what kinds of continuous improvement practices they want to use to take a look at their program and really assess what is going on in terms of how they are preparing teachers to serve students with disabilities. Step 3 is determining then a program review focus. Within this step, this is when a team would determine what particular content or instructional framework they want to focus their program review around. This could be things like evidence-based practices in a particular content area, such as reading or math or writing, or it could be an instructional framework, such as multi-tiered systems of support or universal design for learning or high leverage practices. What we do through the roadmap is provide a lot of resources both to help teams determine that program review focus, and then once the focus has been determined, provide research and best practices related to those content areas or instructional frameworks. Step 4 is the actual act of reviewing the programs. We provide a lot of systematic tools in this roadmap to take a look at preparation experiences within programs pertaining to both the coursework aspect and the clinical experiences aspect. So one thing that we are looking for is making sure that best practices with students with disabilities are integrated across programs, and we're looking for things like potentially gaps in where those practices are covered, or maybe even duplication of efforts, really ways to make sure that we are covering those practices at the appropriate level of depth across the program and the length of the preparation experience. We also provide resources to help take a look at the clinical experience aspect of a program and making sure that there are practice-based opportunities integrated throughout programs to help teacher candidates get those really high-quality experiences to be able to practice the skills that they are learning and then receive structured and guided feedback. The 5th step is then, based on the results of that program review, developing an action plan for improvement. We provide a lot of resources to support with this and to bring all the partners we identified in step 1 together to assign them with actions that can help with continuous improvement. Step 6 is to actually implement the reforms. At this stage, there may be needs for things like teacher professional development, or considering what additional financial resources are needed to support the work, or generally just looking for more information about research and best practices. Within this step of the roadmap, we point you towards some of those resources and provide some guidance to teams who are into that deep implementation phase. Step 7 is practicing continuous improvement. So once you have implemented these reforms, making sure that you are collecting data, monitoring progress, and using that information to make continual adjustments to your program. And finally, scaling impact. We know that beginning with the end in mind, that idea of sustainability and scale up is so important, and that 8th step of the roadmap really deals with how we scale out these efforts across various dimensions, whether that's within the university or to larger audiences like across the state. And we provide resources to help teams consider how they will scale. So I just gave a brief review of the 8 steps of our process. And in order to target my tour of the website with a little more detail, I would like to know where you think your current needs are related to resources and support. And you can pick, please, no more than 2. But I would like to know, what do you think are your greatest areas of need for resources and support that pertain to these 8 steps that I reviewed?
And Lindsay, as people are doing the poll, there was a question that came in the chat pod, so maybe you could address that. And the question is, are community colleges being included in this conversation so that students who begin their coursework at the undergraduate level are seeing similar verbiage and requirements?
That is such a wonderful question, and the answer is yes, community colleges are a very important part of this process. Throughout the roadmap, you will see across those 8 steps a continual emphasis on what we like to call instructional through lines. So are we sending the same kinds of messages about instructional practice when the student is in their community college experience? Are we sending the same messages when that candidate progresses then into their 4-year university setting? And furthermore, are we sending the same messages about high quality instruction when they're out in the district? So a lot of the guidance we provide in the roadmap, yes, is geared toward making sure we have those instructional through lines, and community colleges are a very important part of that. Okay, so we have our results back from the poll, and I think Matt's going to display those for us. And looks like we have quite a mixture of needs, which is interesting to see. I think I see develop an action plan seems to be just barely in the lead, but I think we have a lot of needs that span that whole continuum of the program review and reform process. So that's exciting to see, and I'll make sure I am sort of giving lots of examples from across that whole process when I go to the website. So there's one more thing that I'm going to go over before we dive right into the website, and that is to preview some of the features of the roadmap. These features you will see in both the PDF version of our roadmap and the online version of our roadmap. The online version of our roadmap builds from the PDF in that it gives us the flexibility to provide hyperlinks out to really high quality resources and tools, and it lets us highlight examples of current reform efforts that are underway in our CEEDAR states. But the foundation of our roadmap is based on guiding questions that can help leaders at IHEs and other organizations structure their reform process for their faculty members. And this really stems from the recommendation from the 325T grants, or really a lesson learned that we need that active participation from all stakeholders. As I mentioned, the online version of the roadmap contains examples of collaborative reform efforts that are currently underway, as well as links to tools and resources. And this responds to a need to promote collaboration within and across programs and provide really high quality content resources for program enhancement. And finally, and I think this is a really great feature of this guide, we know that one of the lessons learned from previous preparation reform projects is that there is a need to consider and assess and create readiness for change from faculty for engaging in reform efforts. And because of this, when we were putting this roadmap together, we thought very critically about how we could integrate the principles of implementation science. So things like our active implementation frameworks from NERN, our National Implementation Research Network, things like CBAM, our concerns-based adoption model, and other frameworks that really help us think about readiness for change and implementation science. And so what we wanted to do in this roadmap is make sure that those implementation science principles are woven throughout the entire guide, and really providing those supports to help think about how we are creating readiness for change across faculty. With that, I'm going to now take us into the actual roadmap on our website. So I'm going to show you first how we get there. This is our CEEDAR Center main website, so CEEDAR.org, CEEDAR.org. And the way that you're going to locate our roadmap, and you can see here the sign up for today's webinar, the way you're going to locate the roadmap is by going to Resources and Tools in the navigation bar, and then to Reports and Briefs. If you scroll down a little, the second resource you see is the Roadmap for Educator Preparation Reform. And when we click on that, it takes us to a landing page where we have options to view the online tool or download the PDF. As I mentioned, that PDF, it contains the same guiding questions, the same information that the online tool does, but what the online tool does is provides those hyperlinks to resources and those current examples from CEEDAR States. So I encourage you to take a look at that PDF, but let's click on our online tool. When we do that, it takes us to our homepage for the Roadmap for Educator Preparation Reform. It gives a lot of that basic overview information that I just took you all through. And when we click View the Roadmap, we are taken into our first step, which was Engage Key Leaders. Over here on the left-hand side, we have our navigation bar that again outlines those 8 steps that I previewed for you. So if at any time you want to skip between steps or move ahead, you can go over to the navigation bar. But let's take a look at what one of these pages looks like and what kinds of resources we have available. The first thing we have is just a brief description of the steps. So if you want a reminder of what kinds of actions we're trying to take in this step, we have a short description. We also have a list of outcomes. So what do we expect to see as a result of engaging in this particular step of reform? What kinds of things will we see from our leaders? What kinds of things will we see from our faculty? What kind of outcomes do we expect? If we continue to scroll down, we get to the point of the guiding questions. And again, this is all the content that is also contained in the PDF. But we have underneath each of our steps, we have sub-steps that help guide the team through the process. So here under Step 1, Engage Key Leaders, we have sub-steps for establishing a steering committee, generating support and buy-in, and communicating a vision for reform. If we click on the plus sign to expand the section, what we get is a list of very comprehensive guiding questions. These guiding questions are intended to provide, again, that planning framework for a team to allow them to reflect on this step, the action steps that they have already taken, action steps that they need to take, and how they can strengthen the implementation of this particular step. So we see here for establish a steering committee, the guiding questions are all about who needs to be on that steering committee, do we have the right kinds of leaders there? We have our implementation science principles woven in there with some good reflection questions about who do we think are our early adopters, who are the people who have existing research agendas or do a lot of work in this space. Just generally, these guiding questions are going to help support high quality reflection and planning within a team to help with these steps. The subsequent steps follow that same format. If you expand them out, we have a new set of guiding questions pertaining to the sub-step. And the idea is that a team would work through these together collaboratively in order to come up with their next steps and actions. In order to support teams with those next steps and actions, we have a really great section of our website that is focused entirely on resources and high quality state examples. So our resources, I specifically mentioned implementation science resources is something we wanted woven throughout this guide. In the resources section, we provide hyperlinks out to those tools or resources that can help with that. We have them organized by the type of framework. So if you're an implementation science person, you can find some really great implementation science tools here from NERN that can help you with Step 1, engaging key leaders. Or, if leading by convening is something that's important and ensuring relevant participation is really a high priority for your team, there are resources here. And we also link out to other just really high quality content resources from CEEDAR, the Center on Great Teachers and Leaders, and other federally funded centers that are providing a lot of resource and content information related to evidence-based practices. So these resources, again, help support the implementation of whatever step you're on, and there's a lot of depth here within implementation support for teams. Another really great part of the online guide is we get to highlight the really excellent work that's happening in CEEDAR states. So underneath the examples section pertaining to whatever step it is, so step 1, engage key leaders, we have examples of how CEEDAR states did that in their context. And what we really tried to do was bring these examples to life. So instead of just saying, the CEEDAR state did this, what we really tried to do was make it very concrete. So here with this first example, we have our friends from Kentucky, and we talk a lot about how Kentucky specifically took steps for their context to engage their key leaders. So here you can see details about their Kentucky Excellence in Educator Prep initiative. There are hyperlinks out to that. It talks about how they engaged key leaders through consistent messaging and communication efforts, and it links out to resources that they put together related to their teacher bulletin board or newsletters across the state. So what we really attempted to do through these examples was not just say what had happened in CEEDAR states, but also show you through hyperlinked examples of actual materials that states put together. So our CEEDAR team and those of you who are out in the states have done a lot of really great work, and we tried our best to capture that here. And there's just a lot of depth of information that can really show what these roadmap steps look like in action within a state. And again, if we scroll back up to the top on the left-hand side, we have our navigation bar. If we click to the next step, we're at step 2, facilitate needs assessment. The structure for each page remains the same. So we have the overview, the outcomes, the guiding questions that can be expanded and collapsed based upon what step you are on, and finally, our high-quality implementation resources and our examples from CEEDAR states. With that, I think we have a perfect amount of time left for questions. I'm sure Matt has been moderating the chat pod a bit, and I would be happy to answer questions from the group.
So one of the questions is one I can answer. It was just a reminder of where you can access the roadmap, and there's 2 places that you can access it. As you can see right now, there's Roadmap for Educator Preparation Reform just on the left under the resource area where Lindsay just was. So Lindsay, if you go back up to resources and tools and hover over that on the top.
Oh, apologies.
Yeah, you can see on the left column, Roadmap for Educator Preparation Reform. It's also on our reports page, and the reason for that is because this started out as a PDF resource that got expanded to be this online version. So you can access it by clicking that resource link or in the reports area. The next question is the information shared here and on the website the same or different from the CAPE accreditation process?
That's an excellent question. It is very similar to the CAPE accreditation process. We were very intentional in making the connections to CAPE as we went through the steps of this process. Something that we wanted to do, and you saw that earlier, we know that a lot of the tools that are highlighted in this roadmap could also be duly purposed for CAPE. And I think when that happens, we make connections to the CAPE accreditation process and those guiding questions. So the team can reflect about whether there is a touch point there with CAPE that can be made. And we also provide resources related to CAPE that you can find down in that resource block. So it's an excellent question. And yes, we very intentionally did make connections to CAPE in the development of this guide.
All right, there's a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to try to do them quickly. One of them is, how can I access the recording of this webinar? We'll email that out to you. It'll also be on our webinar section of our website. The next one is, how does CEEDAR distinguish between the needs of English language learners versus students with special needs, given the social construction of disabilities and reality of neurodiversity in our schools? That's
another great question. The Educator Roadmap is really intended to be content agnostic. So as I talk through this tool can work for a team that's looking at evidence-based practices in reading, or a team that is looking for evidence-based practices for students with disabilities who are also English language learners, or teams who are looking at UDL or high leverage practices or any other content or instructional framework. So this actual tool that I went over. It is content agnostic. We try to when it is appropriate, point you toward those resources. So for anybody who is interested, particularly in that intersection between students who have disabilities and students who are also English language learners at this step of the process, step 3, determining your program review focus, we provide a lot of guidance that would point you toward where those literature reviews, research, review of best practices would be located so that you can find more information on that topic.
All right, great. The next question is, how and where does culturally relevant pedagogy intersect with the roadmap?
Another great question, and it's a similar answer to the previous one, where this roadmap really provides a content agnostic framework for the process of preparation reform. And again, at that determining the program review focus, it could very easily be that your team decides that culturally relevant education will be our program review focus, and we point you toward resources that would support with that. But again, the resources that are specifically pertaining to the roadmap and the structure of the roadmap intended to be content agnostic, can speak to any sort of program reform need.
And Lindsay, I also just want to point out that something that we did just release is our culturally relevant education course enhancement module as well. And we'll be having a webinar on that in a couple months. Another question is, are there any fees associated with CEEDAR services? And I'll answer that from the universal side, and you can answer that from the intensive side, Lindsay. So for all the materials that we have on our website, we really encourage you to use them in any way that's necessary. We just ask you to cite CEEDAR and the point that you got from on the website whenever you use it in your courses or in your materials.
Excellent answer, Matt. I have nothing to add.
How will you train the individuals who conduct the reviews?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. It says, how will you train the individuals who will conduct the reviews?
Yet another great question. So at this step 4, when we're actually, when a team is actually to the point of being ready to review programs, CEEDAR, we have very great resources to help do that. They're called innovation configurations, and they're basically self-assessment tools to help faculty or professional development providers assess the extent to which evidence-based practices are taught and then practiced by teacher candidates within programs. And if we click on those, and again, the innovation configurations, they span a lot of different content areas, a lot of different frameworks. There's probably a topic or content area on this list that you might be interested in. But to your question about training, we do provide a video tutorial for how to use the IHEs. It's really in-depth, and that can help fill in some of those gaps around how you actually would conduct a program review with your faculty.
So we are getting to the very end of this webinar. So what I did is I put a survey link in there. We'd appreciate it if you would be able to fill that out to help us improve our webinars in the future, and your feedback is very valuable. But there are a couple other questions. So if Lindsay's good for staying on a couple minutes longer, if you ask these questions, feel free to stay on and we'll go through the rest of these. But if you have to hop off, we'd appreciate if you could do the survey before you did. Another question was from Julie Blair, and it's, will AAQEP be considered too down the line?
AQEP, good question. I think there are some general similarities just sort of in that accreditation and approval process, and I think the roadmap speaks to those processes generally enough that any states or universities that do AQEP could absolutely find resources that are useful, have reflection exercises that are useful. But yes, we do recognize that there are many more states and universities out there moving to that framework.
And I think that's all the questions that we have in the chat pod so far. But one thing that I did want to point out is one of the great extensions of the online version of this roadmap as opposed to the PDF version is the ability to look at the case studies from reform that's going on around the country right now. And we are kind of limited in just the sense of our own network in reaching out to these great examples. But if there's anyone who's using the roadmap that feels like they have an example that they want to add to this page, on the bottom of each one of these sections with the case studies, if you scroll down just a little bit, Lindsay, you can see there's an add your own example or submit your own example section. So as we saw from the initial survey, so many IHEs are undergoing reform right now. So if you feel like some resources that you've used or that your IHE is a great example to be included on this, feel free to submit your own example there. All right, well, I think that is everyone's questions. Thank you so much for the kind words in the chat pod, as well as your attendance on this webinar. We'll send out a follow-up email in just a few days after we caption it so that you can send it on to any of your colleagues that weren't able to make the live version. We'll also post it on our website. Thank you very much for your attendance.